For over 1,000 years there was one church, one faith stretching from the cold shores of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, from the frozen forests of Russia to the marble palaces of Rome. It was the spine of an entire civilization, the force that held kingdoms together, gave meaning to birth and death, and told every man, woman, and child who they were and where they stood in the universe. Emperors knelt before its altars. Warriors rode to battle under its banners. The sick prayed to its saints. The dying whispered its prayers. This was not merely a religion. It was the architecture of an entire world. But underneath the incense and the candlelight, underneath the golden icons and the marble columns, something had been cracking for centuries. A fault line running silently through the heart of the Christian world, invisible to most, felt deeply by a few. A fracture between East and West, between Rome and Constantinople, between two visions of what Christianity was, who led it, and how it should be lived. And in the summer of 1054, that fault line finally broke open, and the Christian world has never been the same since. To understand why Christianity split, you must first understand the world it was splitting from. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the West in 476 AD, it did not collapse everywhere. In the East, the empire survived, transformed, Greek-speaking, centered on the magnificent city of Constantinople, which its inhabitants called simply the New Rome. Here the emperor remained supreme, not just in politics but in religious life. The Eastern Church developed under the shadow of imperial power, with the emperor holding enormous influence over theological decisions, church councils, and the appointment of patriarchs. Religion and state were woven together into a single seamless garment. In the West, it was entirely different. Rome had fallen. The Western emperors were gone or powerless. Into that vacuum stepped the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Without a strong emperor to overshadow him, the Pope grew in power, in ambition, and in theological self-confidence. He began to claim something extraordinary, that he was not merely one bishop among many, but the supreme leader of all Christians everywhere, the heir of St. Peter himself, God's representative on earth. To Constantinople, this claim was deeply unwelcome. They had their own ancient patriarchs in Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople itself. Who was Rome to claim supremacy over all of them? The argument had been simmering for centuries, but now it was approaching boiling point. The Great Schism of 1054 did not happen overnight. It was the culmination of centuries of growing disagreement, theological, political, cultural, and deeply personal. The arguments were many and the wounds were old. The first and most explosive was the question of the Holy Spirit. In the original Nicene Creed, the foundational statement of Christian belief agreed upon by all, it was written that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father. The Western Church had quietly added 3 Latin words, and from the Son, the filioque clause. To Rome, this was a clarification. To Constantinople, it was heresy, an unauthorized tampering with a document agreed upon by all Christianity. You do not change the creed, they thundered, without a universal council. The Pope had no right. The second great argument was authority itself. Rome claimed the Pope was supreme over all Christians. Constantinople insisted that the 5 great patriarchs, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, held equal authority, with Rome perhaps first among equals but certainly not supreme ruler. The third argument was territory. As Christianity spread into new lands, Bulgaria, Moravia, the Slavic kingdoms, both Rome and Constantinople raced to bring these new Christians under their own influence. Missionaries clashed. Bishops competed. Each side accused the other of poaching souls that rightfully belonged to them. And underneath all of it ran a deeper, less theological river of tension. Rome spoke Latin. Constantinople spoke Greek. They read different texts, celebrated different liturgies, ate different foods, and increasingly lived in different worlds. The split was not just coming, it had in many ways already arrived. By the middle of the 11th century, the fault line needed only the right men in the wrong moment to finally crack open. And history, with its dark sense of humor, provided exactly that. In Rome sat Pope Leo IX, a reforming, energetic, deeply ambitious pope determined to reassert papal authority across the Christian world and clean up a church he saw as corrupt and undisciplined. He was not a man inclined toward compromise or patience. In Constantinople sat Patriarch Michael Cerularius, equally proud, equally stubborn, a man who had spent years resisting what he saw as Rome's arrogant overreach into Eastern Church affairs. He had already taken the provocative step of closing Latin churches in Constantinople that refused to follow Eastern practices. These were not men built for diplomacy. They were men built for confrontation. And into this volatile situation, Pope Leo sent his personal representative to Constantinople, Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida. Humbert was, if anything, even less suited to delicate negotiation than the men who sent him. He was brilliant, combative, contemptuous of the Eastern Church, and utterly convinced of Rome's absolute supremacy. When he arrived in Constantinople in 1054, the collision was not just possible, it was inevitable. July 16, 1054, the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Christian world, the Church of Holy Wisdom, whose dome seemed to float miraculously above Constantinople as if suspended from heaven by a golden chain. It was a Saturday afternoon. The divine liturgy was being celebrated. The great cathedral was full of worshippers, clergy, and officials. Incense drifted through the vast golden interior. Choirs filled the air. And then Cardinal Humbert walked in. He walked not as a worshipper, not as a diplomat, not as a guest. He walked as a man delivering a verdict. He strode through the congregation, up to the high altar, and placed upon it a document that would echo through history for nearly 1,000 years. It was a bull of excommunication, a formal document declaring Patriarch Michael Cerularius and his supporters cut off from the Church of Rome, condemned for heresy, pride, and rebellion against God's appointed representative on earth. Humbert turned, walked back through the stunned and silent congregation, and paused only once at the door to shake the dust from his feet, a biblical gesture of absolute rejection and finality. Michael Cerularius's response was swift and total. He convened a council. He excommunicated Humbert and the papal legates in return. He burned the bull of excommunication in the street. The Church of Christ, the institution that claimed to represent the love, unity, and salvation of all humanity, had just formally declared itself its own enemy. One church had become two, and the wound has never healed. In the centuries that followed, the two branches of Christianity did not merely remain separate. They grew in opposite directions, developing distinct theologies, distinct aesthetics, distinct relationships with political power, and distinct understandings of what it meant to be Christian. The Roman Catholic Church, centered in Rome, became increasingly centralized and hierarchical. The Pope's authority grew. The Crusades were launched in his name. Gothic cathedrals rose across Europe, their spires reaching toward a heaven that felt both glorious and demanding. Theology became increasingly rationalized, systematized by scholars like Thomas Aquinas into vast intellectual structures of breathtaking complexity. Confession, indulgences, purgatory. The Western Church built an elaborate spiritual architecture that would eventually crack under the weight of the Protestant Reformation. The Eastern Orthodox Church took a different path. Without a single supreme leader, it developed as a family of national churches, Greek, Russian, Serbian, Romanian, Bulgarian, each autocephalous, each self-governing, but sharing a common liturgy, common theology, and common spiritual tradition. The divine liturgy remained in Greek or local languages. Icons, those flat, golden, otherworldly images of Christ and the saints, remained at the heart of worship. The mystery of God was to be experienced, not systematized, felt, not merely reasoned. The two Christianities had become, in many ways, two different relationships with the divine. If 1054 was the formal break, what came after made healing almost impossible. The deepest wound came in 1204, not from pagans or Muslims, but from fellow Christians. The Fourth Crusade, launched by Rome to recapture Jerusalem, was diverted through greed, debt, and political manipulation to Constantinople itself. For 3 days, Crusader soldiers, Western Christians wearing the cross of Christ, sacked the greatest Christian city in the world. They looted the Hagia Sophia. They smashed its sacred relics. They placed a prostitute on the patriarch's throne as a mockery. They melted down golden icons for coins. They killed Orthodox priests. The massacre and looting of Constantinople by Catholic crusaders in 1204 inflicted a trauma on Eastern Christianity that no formal document of reconciliation has ever fully healed. Orthodox Christians remember 1204. They remember it the way a person remembers a betrayal by someone they loved. The excommunications of 1054 were eventually lifted. In 1964, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras formally revoked them in a gesture of reconciliation that moved both men to tears. But lifting an excommunication is not the same as healing a civilization's wound. The two churches remain separate to this day. The conversation continues. The reunion has not yet come. Nearly 1,000 years have passed since that July afternoon in the Hagia Sophia. The world has changed beyond anything Cardinal Humbert or Patriarch Cerularius could have imagined. Empires have risen and fallen. Constantinople became Istanbul. The Soviet Union tried to extinguish orthodoxy and failed. The Catholic Church has held a Second Vatican Council and transformed itself, and yet the split endures. There are today approximately 1.3 billion Catholics in the world, and roughly 260 million Orthodox Christians, together representing the largest single religious tradition in human history, still divided by the events of 1054. The division has shaped geopolitics, culture, and civilization in ways we rarely acknowledge. The line between Catholic and Orthodox Europe is not just a theological line. It is a cultural, political, and civilizational one. It runs through Ukraine and Serbia and Romania. It shaped the Cold War. It shapes the conflict in Ukraine today. When you see tension between Russia and the West, between Eastern and Western Europe, between two visions of what Europe is and should be, you are, in part, seeing the very long shadow of 1054. A pair of scissors cut the beard from a Russian nobleman in 1698. A document placed on an altar in 1054 cut something far deeper. It cut a world in two, and the cut is still bleeding. And there you have it. Nearly 1,000 years after that document was placed on an altar in the Hagia Sophia, the wound is still there, still felt, still shaping the world we live in today. That is the extraordinary power of history. It never truly ends. It simply changes its clothes and walks into the next century. If this story moved you or taught you something new, please hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely keeps this channel alive and growing. And now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what history subject are you most curious about? A forgotten empire, a mysterious figure, a lost civilization? Write it down, because our next video might be your idea brought to life. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story. Until then, keep digging. The most extraordinary chapters of history are always the ones hiding just beneath the surface.